Hi, today's study will be on the pre-wrath rapture position. And let me share my screen. So this is the final in a series of 4. We already talked about the pre-tribulation, mid-tribulation, post-tribulation, and now this is the pre-tribulation, the pre-wrath rapture. Oops. This is a very simplified view of the chronology of it. So the timeline, this first 3.5 years of a 7-year period is the beginning of birth pangs. At the midpoint, you see that the Antichrist sets up the abomination of desolation. Then we have the Antichrist's great tribulation, with the emphasis on it being called the Great Tribulation. That whole period of time is not the tribulation. It's just first 3.5 years, then the Antichrist Great Tribulation. Then there's a question mark there for the rapture and the resurrection, because at the time of that 7-year period is cut short, and we're not sure where during that second 3.5 years. And the second coming is a period of time, as you can see, and it involves the day of the Lord's wrath, and we're going to get into those details. This is a more detailed timeline that gets a little more specific. So the beginning of that 7-year period would start with the Antichrist's covenant with many in Daniel 9:27, if you want to look that up. The abomination that causes desolation is in Daniel 9:27 and Matthew 24:15, and that is the start of the Great Tribulation. That's the latter 3.5 years where the Antichrist reigns, Christians face intense persecution, and then at some point there's a rapture along with Christ's appearance in the clouds, and these are the verses that relate to that. Following the rapture, God's wrath begins. And then at this point, Christ returns to Jerusalem and takes the reign away from the Antichrist. So it's described as a process and not happening all in one day. Then 30 days later, the Battle of Armageddon begins. The Antichrist and false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire. Revelation 19:20, Daniel 12:11. Then 45 days later, the millennium starts, and the millennial reign is 1,000 years, followed by the final judgment, and then the new heaven and the new earth. So what is the history of this position? Well, there are at least 9 early church fathers who teach that the church will go through the Great Tribulation and face persecution by the Antichrist. And as I said if you watch the post-tribulation rapture video, I use this same point because what the early church fathers say line up with both the post-tribulation and pre-wrath position. So I'm using the same point. The early church fathers do not use those terms, post-trib or pre-wrath. They're just describing events. And so you got to look carefully at what they're describing. I also have another presentation on the early church fathers that you'll want to take a look at just to see all those things that they say. Now, most pre-tribulationists admit that the early church fathers were post-tribulationists, but taught imminence. So they believe the idea for pre-tribulation was there. Pre-tribulationist Larry Crutchfield actually even called the beliefs of the early church fathers, rather than post-trib, he called them intra-tribulationism. And he is unintentionally accurate here. So that belief is much closer to what becomes pre-wrath. Early church fathers affirm that the church goes through the Great Tribulation, faces the persecution of the Antichrist, but is taken up at a day or hour that no one knows, close to the end, sometime during that latter 3.5 years. All right, our second point is that the pre-wrath rapture view was first conceived by Robert Van Kempen, and he was friends with Marvin Rosenthal. We'll learn about those in a minute. Marvin Rosenthal was a staunch pre-tribulationist. He was gung-ho about that. But then after many conversations with Robert Van Kampen, both began to flesh out what Rosenthal later called pre-wrath in the 1990s. So this is a relatively recent view. very young, although, like I said, the early church fathers, what they describe lines up with this as well. So even though that term is recent, it goes back to and lines up with something that is part of the ancient church. So Rosenthal was the first to write a book on the topic, the Prewrath Rapture of the Church, and Van Kampen followed that. Even though he was the first one to have this idea, he followed that with his own book called The Sign. All right, let's talk about who's who. The denomination, mainly Baptists and evangelicals. Marvin Rosenthal, who we've already mentioned. He is Russian Jewish-born Christian minister and founder of the Holy Land Experience in Florida. And I have actually been to that. It's like a theme park that has takes you kind of through the Holy Land. He was the executive director of the Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry, which I'm actually very familiar with because when I was growing up, my mother always had calendars related to that, got stuff related to I don't know, she was reading literature related to their ministry. Later, though, Rosenthal founded Zion's Hope after he changed his views on the rapture. He actually went through a very difficult period because he was the one in the Friends of Israel ministry that he was involved in. He was the one who insisted upon putting the pre-tribulation rapture language in, saying that anyone who was part of that organization had to believe that. Usually that's seen as a peripheral extra thing that is not required because it's not a major doctrine. It's like a secondary doctrine. So, but he was adamant that that was in the Friends of Israel literature or position. So when he changed his views later on, he decided to step down from that ministry and he started Zion's Hope, which is a ministry to, they help out Jews in Israel. They go to Israel on tours as well. He has a ministry there in Winter Garden, Florida, and leads Bible studies, has multiple people in the organization who teach and preach on this topic, not just on end times, but also just Bible teaching in general. And they have a newsletter that they put out as well. So then, this is showing you the book that he wrote, that Prewrath Rapture of the Church, which I talked about earlier. And this is the Holy Land Experience. He does not own that anymore. He did sell that. So it is not, what it has become today is not what it was under him. So Robert Van Kampen, we mentioned him earlier, 1938 to 1999. He was a businessman in the investment banking world, and he helped develop the pre-wrath position in the 1990s, as I said earlier, along with Marvin Rosenthal. And he has written 3 books on the topic: The Sign, The Rapture Question Answered, plain and simple. And then this is actually a novel, The Fourth Reich, based upon these ideas. So I have not had a chance to read that one. All right, another person who holds this view is Alan Kirshner. He is a Bible scholar and author. He teaches Greek at the Center for Learning Biblical Greek. He wrote Antichrist Before the Day of the Lord and Pre-Wrath, a very short introduction. That was the one right here. He also created the documentary 7 Pre-Trib Problems and the Pre-Wrath Rapture. You can get that on YouTube. Just type that in and you will find that documentary. It's a 2-hour documentary, but I highly recommend it. It makes it very clear. Clearer than what I'm going to present to you today. I'm doing more something on the history and the who's who, but he really has interviews with various people who hold pre-wrath views and just describes the arguments really well. So I highly recommend watching that. He also has a podcast called The Biblical Prophecy Program, and he will begin publishing the Biblical Prophecy magazine this winter, and I look forward to getting that. All right, Gordon Lawrence is a conference speaker, former pastor and associate director of research of the North American Mission Board in Atlanta. He also went to Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, which is my alma mater, and he lives fairly close to me. So I actually, once I get deeper into and actually have read his book and feel like I know a little more about that, I would love to reach out to him and have a conversation with him about all of this stuff. What I really like about his book, The Silence in Heaven, actually it's right here, Silence in Heaven. It is very readable, and just the way that it's written, it has lots of charts and pictures. I think it's hard for you to see, but like, I just really like the format of the book, and it's very helpful the way it's outlined. It doesn't read like a normal academic textbook. So it's just really, really helpful. The Revelation Equation is another book that he has written as well on the second coming. David Rosenthal is the son of Marvin Rosenthal, vice president of Zion's Hope and managing editor of Zion's Fire. So Zion's Fire is the magazine that they put out. He focuses on the geopolitical events in the Middle East. So the current events that are going on right now in the Middle East, he talks about those kinds of things and relates things that are going on with biblical prophecy, talks about just with a unique perspective, being Jewish as well as being Christian. And he brings a lot to the table with that. I actually had an opportunity to meet him and his wife and had lunch with them when I was visiting my sister in Florida. And it was just a wonderful opportunity to pick his brain on a few things. So that was I was really excited to meet him. And it would be great if I could talk to him further in the future, because he knows a lot more than I do on this topic and has really studied up on this. This is the Zion's Fire magazine. I've been getting this for several years, and I highly recommend it. I believe it's free. I don't think I pay anything for that, but just look that up, Zion's Fire online, and I'm sure that you can go there and subscribe and get that to your home. And it gives just articles, very colorful magazine and it's short. It's not a very thick magazine, so you can read through it quickly. It just has a few articles on end-time prophecy, current events, doctrine, and apologetics. Charles Cooper is pastor, author, and director of the Prewrath Resource Institute in Orlando, Florida. He taught homiletics and hermeneutics at Moody Bible Institute and has planted 3 churches. And he actually appears in the documentary that Alan Kirshner does on the 7 pre-trib problems in Prewrath Rapture. So that's where I learned about him and his position on this. Ryan Habina, he is pastor, author of the Parable of the Fig Tree that you see right here. He also appeared in that documentary, and that's also how I learned about him. So like I said, that's a great resource for learning about who is who in this with the Prewrath position. And then finally, Alan Hultberg. He is a PhD, author, associate professor of Bible exposition and New Testament at Talbot School of Theology. And he was a contributor to the Apologetic Study Bible, which is interesting. I've had that Bible for years and love it. And he's also a contributor to the 3 views on the rapture, pre-tribulation, pre-wrath, or post-tribulation. And this book actually has Blazing, who is post-trib, I believe, and Moo, who is pre-trib, and they go back and forth and will share their arguments and then do a rebuttal of each other. So it's like seeing a debate, but in print. And I have that book. I just got it today, actually. So I was using that to kind of help me find a few points for this presentation. So that is Alan Hultberg is the one who gives the pre-wrath position in this book, and so he's contributed to that. Now let's get into the arguments and the scriptural support. We're combining those together. The first one is the church will be raptured after the great tribulation, but before the day of the Lord. So let me go ahead and just jump in. If you want to turn to Matthew 24:29 through 31, we're going to read that to show you that it's after the Great Tribulation. It says, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with the great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. And then turn to 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 6. This is another passage that talks about how how we're raptured after the Great Tribulation. Now we request you, brethren, with regard to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, that you not be quickly shaken from your composure or be disturbed either by a spirit or a message or a letter as if from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. So we know here that it's talking about the day of the Lord. Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come, meaning the rapture will not come unless the apostasy comes first. The apostasy, remember, is the falling away of many people who call themselves Christians. They fall away from the faith. And the man of lawlessness is revealed, and that man of lawlessness is the Antichrist, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. Do you not remember that while I was still with you, I was telling you these things? And you know what restrains him now, so that in his time he will be revealed. So we see there for sure that it's referring to the day of the Lord and how these things have to come to pass beforehand. So the apostasy, the Antichrist, then the Great Tribulation, and then the day of the Lord is the order of things. Now, going on, the Great Tribulation refers to the last 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week, that 7-year period. It is inaccurate to refer to the entire 7-year period as the tribulation, because we see here that it's the Great Tribulation. And I'm going to read you 2 passages that refer to it that way. Matthew 24:21 says, "For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will." Revelation 7:14 says, "These are the ones who come out of the great tribulation, and they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb." All right. So let's go on to the next point. Point number 2 is the church will experience persecution by the Antichrist, but the time will be cut short. Let's turn to Matthew 24. Verse 9 says, "Then they will hand you over to be persecuted, and they will kill you. You will be hated by all nations because of my name." So this is talking about the persecution by the Antichrist. 13 says, "But the one who endures to the end will be saved." 21 says, "For at that time there will be great distress." Another word for that would be tribulation, the kind that hasn't taken place from the beginning of the world until now and never will again. 22 says, "Unless those days were cut short, no one would be saved. But those days will be cut short because of the elect." So I believe that if it went the full 7 years, there would not be a single Christian left on this earth. So at some point it's cut short and the rapture occurs so that God can save those who remain in the rapture, and he can rescue them. And so that actually just comes straight from that passage. Number 3, the church is raptured prior to God's wrath. And that is described in 3 different passages. 1 Thessalonians 5, 9 through 10. It says, "For God has not destined us for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we will live together with him." 1 Thessalonians 1:10 says, "And to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who rescues us from the coming wrath." Romans 5:9 is another passage that describes the wrath. So since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him, through Jesus? So I actually discussed these passages in the pre-tribulation presentation that I gave. And I described how the wrath, I believed that the wrath doesn't necessarily mean the wrath of the end times when the trumpets and the bowls are poured out. It could just be talking about the divine wrath that God puts on all unbelievers, no matter what time period they died in, at the end when they go to hell if they did not receive Christ as their Savior. So I actually, in this book today, the Rapture book by Alan Holtberg, he does discuss this. So I wanted to share with you what he thought on this topic. And so you can get a well-rounded view on that. So he does mention all three of these passages. He says, certainly Paul can mean by these statements that believers will not be exposed to the wrath of God in the final judgment because of the atonement brought by Christ. This is probably the case for Romans 5:9. So here he is agreeing with me that Romans 5:9, because of the context, is probably not referring to the wrath that's involved with the trumpets and the bowls at the end of the age. It's more likely to be talking about just wrath in general that people experience in hell. So I'm glad to see that he agrees with me on that. He goes on to say about, because in First Thessalonians and Second Thessalonians, First Thessalonians, where it talks about 5:9 through 10, he is saying that in 1 verse 10, that in those passages, the context, he's saying, is the end times, and it does bring that up. And I think that in my previous presentation, I said it was not the context. In some of these cases, it is. One of the Thessalonians passages, I don't believe it really is, but the other one it is. So he's saying here, though, this may refer generally to salvation from divine judgment, but the context, he says, both in 2 Thessalonians 2 and the broader Thessalonian correspondence, meaning the whole correspondence, because the correspondence, the whole letter does refer a lot to the end times. He suggests it includes the divine wrath to be brought at the parousia. So when he's saying parousia, he's talking about the return, the second coming, and the rapture time. So he is suggesting that, and I will concede that that's a possibility in that case. I'm not going to totally give up my belief on that, because I don't think that you can be dogmatic, and I think it's possible. It is not referring at all to the wrath at the end times, that it's only referring to divine judgment that goes to all unbelievers, not just those living in these times. So, and I think, if you refer to my previous, I don't want to go into it again, but when I was discussing the pre-trib presentation, I explained why I felt like one of those verses was specifically talking about not just those who are, because it discusses not just those who are raptured, but those who had already died, and those people aren't participating. It doesn't even make sense for it to apply to them. So it is an area where you have to be willing to just say, okay, we can agree to disagree, and I may or may not be right on this. So I'm not completely sure. All right, going ahead to the Great Tribulation is Satan's wrath. Revelation 12:12 through 17. It says, therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great fury, because he knows he has a short time. When the dragon saw that he had been thrown to earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. The woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle. Now this woman is referring to Israel, because that is, the male child is referring to Jesus, and he is an Israelite. The woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she could fly from the serpent's presence to her place in the wilderness, where she was fed for a time times and half a time. So we know that for those 3.5 years that that's referring to, it's talking about those 144,000 who will be able to flee into the wilderness and be saved. So, wow, I'm just seeing this right now that some people aren't sure if that's referring to just Jews, just Israelites, the 144,000, or if that's a reference to the church. I definitely think that from this, since it's talking about the woman, we know that that woman is Israel. So I believe that that 144,000 and those people that are able to flee to that wilderness for time and half a time are those Jewish people who are sealed in that time. So they're able to hide. And going on, that was some commentary, but going back to verse 15, from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river flowing after the woman to sweep her away in a torrent. But the earth helped the woman. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the river that the dragon had spewed from his mouth. So the dragon was furious with the woman and left to wage war on the rest of her offspring. So what's happening is that the Antichrist is going to try to get at these people who are sealed. He's not going to be successful. Somehow the earth is going to conspire against him. He's using water in some way. I don't know if he tries to dam something up and tries to come after them to get them out, but maybe there's an earthquake or something that swallows up that water and they're protected from him. But he can't get to them, so he gets angry and he wages war against the rest of her offspring. Well, who are the offspring of Israel? And that would be the church. So, and it clarifies here too. It says, those who keep God's commands and have the testimony about Jesus. So that is the church. So it's showing you here that the church, when he can't get to the Jews that are sealed, Satan stomps off in a rage and a fury and goes after the church. And of course, when we're talking about Satan, we're saying he's using the Antichrist to do this. So the persecution of the church by the Antichrist is a result of Satan's wrath, which should be distinguished from God's wrath. It's very different from God's wrath. And this is where I believe the pre-tribulationists and sometimes the post-tribulationists get this confused. So this is definitely not God's wrath during this time period. This persecution time is Satan's wrath. Remember, he counterfeits everything that God does. And so he's trying to do his own version. All right, this last point is the timing of the rapture. The church is raptured at the 6th seal, and God's wrath includes the trumpet and bowl judgments. So the 7th seal will come obviously after the 6th seal, and at this point, the rapture is happening, and then the pre-wrath position believes that the trumpet and bowl judgments are part of that wrath. Now, these 3 sets of judgments, and by that I mean the seal, trumpet, and bowl judgments, are seen as consecutive rather than staggered or overlapping. So the textbook view of pre-wrath position sees these judgments as consecutive. Now, I would say that if you did a plain reading of Revelation, as complex as it is, difficult to understand, that would be a natural conclusion to come to because they appear to happen consecutively in the text. And the seals are described in Revelation 6 and 8, and then the trumpets are Revelation 8, 9, and 11, and the bowls are Revelation 15 and 16. And there's some intervening chapter where different things are thrown in that relate to what is going on. So they appear consecutive. So that's definitely, I'm not going to argue that that is a valid way of seeing this. However, I don't agree with this, and I do disagree with the pre-wrath position on this point. If you've watched Ruth's presentation, one of her earliest presentations, it might have been the first or the second one on the end time chronology, she described how she thinks the seals and the bowls and the trumpets are staggered. Now, the post-tribulation position believes they completely overlap and are imposed upon one another, but I believe they're more, as well as my sister, believe that they are more of a staggered situation. And I believe this because the language of seal 6, trumpet 7, and bowl 7 is exactly the same, and it describes the same events involving those cosmic disturbances that we've talked about a lot if you've been with us for any amount of time. They are only likely to happen once. So it makes no sense for them to repeat themselves in these 3 different occasions. So, and I also think that we need to look at the places in the text where the word wrath appears. If we're thinking of pre-wrath and talking about where does the wrath happen, it happens in seal 6, trumpet 7, and all of the bowls. And I described that when I talked about post-tribulation. So, and I also mentioned some other things about the sun scorching believers during the 4th bowl, which suggests they were there for that. So I'm not going to be dogmatic on that. I am not sure exactly how it's going to play out, but I just want to say that in this, just where I am right now in my study, I believe that I differ from Prewrath on the timing of the rapture when it is regarding this specific topic. I also was discovering when I was reading today Holtberg's book, I discovered that the pre-wrath position doesn't see the second coming of Christ happening on the exact same day as the rapture. Whereas when I described post-tribulation, I described a quote by someone in that presentation that said that it likened it to a dignitary coming to the town, and when they were coming, they were not quite there yet. Those who were their children or were in good standing with them would run out to greet them and then immediately come back in to town with them, whereas those who were not in good standing with that ruler would stay at home. So that was a picture of how this is going to work. That's apparently a very post-trib way of looking at it. I really do believe, I'm leaning right now at least toward that view of it. So I believe that they meet him in the air and immediately come back with him. But it's possible there's a period of intervening time where some things take place before all that happens. So I'm not going to be, that's not my final answer is what I'm saying. I'm going to give it some more study and look into this a bit more. But I just wanted to show you that those different views are out there. So I hope you have enjoyed this presentation on the pre-wrath rapture position, and I'd love to hear your feedback. And join us for our next presentations. Thank you.